Hi, and welcome back. Today we're having a look at installing a radiant floor, and our situation is such that the radiant floor will be above the subfloor, so it sits on top of the subfloor and will be directly underneath the flooring. So there are some systems on the market where you can buy these already pre-routed. I didn't go that way for two reasons. One was that it's a 1,500 square foot project, 8 loops, and it's rather complicated, and I wanted to be able to run things in a certain way, and routing it myself gives me all that control. The second is I'm looking at about $1.50 a square foot doing it this way versus $10 a square foot if I bought it pre-routed. So that's why I decided to go with this. Now the trade-off is the time. It can take a lot of time. My first 4x8 sheet of plywood took me probably about 6 hours. So I worked on getting the time down because that's just not a fair trade-off. 6 hours of time is worth money as well. So I've got it down so that it's between 1.5 hours and 2.5 hours per sheet of 4x8 plywood, which I consider to be an acceptable amount of time. So I'm going to share some of those secrets today about how to do it quickly, keep your time down, and save your money that way as well. So to get started, of course, you're going to need enough plywood to complete your square footage. You're going to want some clamps, 2 sets or 3 sets at least. Of course, you're going to need a router, tape measure. Very important, you need a plan. Protective gear, trust me, this is really dusty. So you want some good goggles, otherwise you're going to have wood in your eyes. Respirator, ear protection. For router bits, I'm using the 3/4 inch core box, and for the channels, and then for the turns, I'm using I started with the double flute straight 5/8 inch. If you had one that was up to 3/4, that would be fine. However, mine broke, so now I'm down to using my double flute straight 1/2 inch. So that brings me to my next point. These are 1/4 inch shafts. They, of course, will break easier than a 1/2 inch shaft. So if you can get your router bits in a 1/2 inch shaft, that would be good. Or 3/8 even. And also I've got a 600 grit diamond file to sharpen the router bits. There's an awful lot of routing to do. We need 2 or 3 straight 2x4s to act as a guide that we're going to travel along. And you're going to be out here all day, so get yourself a nice hot tea and a thermos. We all want a hot tea. So I've got my router depth set to 5/8, and I'm using 3/4 inch plywood. If you're using a 1/2 inch PEX, you're going to want to use 3/4 inch plywood. And I'm going to route to 5/8 because the outer diameter of my 1/2 inch PEX is actually 9/16. 5/8 is 10/16, so it's a little bit bigger. That lets my Omega channel heat transfer plate sit in nicely. And it's also, the last consideration is that when the PEX is in here, you have to remember that you don't want the flooring on top to be pinching it because it needs to expand and contract as the temperature changes. A general guide is 100 feet of PEX, 100 feet of 1/2 inch PEX is going to expand 1 inch for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit that it increases in temperature. So it's going to be sliding back and forth, and if you've got things really tight in here, then I just don't like the idea of it rubbing on anything and possibly creating any type of integrity loss to the walls of the PEX. This is in your floor and you're not going to know if it leaks, so best to be careful, be on the safe side. Another little tip is to set up your workstation on as high sawhorses as you have, because it's back-breaking work, and if you can get it up a little higher, then well, that's always better, isn't it? So also, if you can do it outside, it is very, very, very dirty. Everything will get covered. So if you can do it outside, do that. It's a lot quicker cleanup later on. It's also helpful to have some 2x4s underneath, sitting on top of your sawhorses. This gives some additional support to the 4x8 sheet of plywood. So I've drawn a layout on the 4x8 sheet of plywood in accordance with the appropriate section of the floor plan. So we're on panel 6, which is in this area, and we've got a feed, and then it returns as it comes down here. So on here, the information I've got is panel 6. This is the layout where panel 6 is. North is that way once we're laying it down. And some other things that just save a bit of time in the layout. You don't have to do these, but I like to put a dotted line where the beginning of the bend, the loop bend when it goes the opposite way, the 180 degree there. I like to just put a dotted line here, and another one 6 inches away, and this gives me my minimum bend radius, which in the 1/2 inch, you don't want it too tight because you don't want it to buckle. So minimum 6 inches, and then I'll draw a rough layout because I'm going to be routing this by hand, and so then that gives me a rough idea, and I'd want to do minimum that. The pipe is going, not only does it need to turn in here and have enough space to do so without kinking, but it needs to expand and contract. Also, just so I can keep straight, I like to put things in like which loop I'm dealing with, the direction of the water flow, because then I can double check with my layout and just make sure I've got all the loops where they're supposed to be and they're heading where they're supposed to be heading. Save time on layout if you have the space. Lay the new board next to the old one. Your measurements are already completed. Saves a lot of measuring time. One time-saving tip is after you have your layout, measure, in my case, it's 3 1/8 from the guide edge to the edge of my bit. And so I'll measure 3 1/8 across all of my lines to be cut. So then when I put my guide down, then my router, my bit will be in the right spot, and I'll get my carving out. Do them all at once, saves time. Another time-saving tip is to lay out as many guides as you can at one time. In my case, I'm going to do 3 just because I only have 6 clamps. And I'm going to space them every second routing to be cut, just so that I have room to work in between. Now when I do this, I'm going to have all my safety gear on, and I'm going to use a certain technique that is not technically correct and can be dangerous, so I don't suggest it unless you're comfortable using a router. You've used one before, you know how they're going to respond. It's certainly not textbook, and it's cringeworthy at times, but it saves a lot of time. I need to do a depth that is deeper than my router bit, and so normally what I would do is I would do a shallow pass and then reset my bit depth, do another pass, reset my bit depth, and route it out that way. But the adjustments, everything takes time. So again, this can be dangerous. Don't do it unless you're comfortable. I take no responsibility for the results. It does save me time, and I choose to do it for that reason. The technique really consists of laying the flat guide of the router against the guide 2x4, and we're going to do shallow passes. So the router will naturally be on an angle this way, and we're going to move it in the direction of the slant. And between pressing slightly against the 2x4 and moving in the direction of the slant is also opposite the rotational spin of the bit, and that's going to help us keep it in control. Now again, this is not the way it's intended. This is dangerous. This is not for everybody. Use it at your own risk. I don't condone you using this, especially if you're not comfortable. This is simply a demonstration of what I do to save time. 3 or 4 passes and then one final just to make sure everything's clean on the bottom, and we're all set. And then I'll just move to my next one and move to my next one. Make sure you keep an eye on your power cord. Keep it out of the way. Think safety first. Again, this can be dangerous, but it's shaved off about 2 hours per sheet of plywood from the routing, so it's about half the time that it takes me to do it. Just wanted to stop to show you something. So I've checking my router bit here. So I've just done my first cut. It's not quite deep enough. I know from previous experience that I want it to be into the bottom ply, just into the bottom ply. And if it is, then I know I'm deep enough. This is a real Goldilocks situation, because if you're too deep, then it makes installing these more difficult. They'll break apart. You'll need more points to fix them. If it's too shallow, then you're going to pinch your PEX pipe and it could get cut. Who knows? Because it's going to be expanding, moving back and forth, expanding, contracting. So you want that sweet spot. Not too deep, but not too shallow. In this case, I know from experience that I want to be just into that bottom ply. So I'm just going to set my router bit a little deeper and then continue. So I've sanded them, they feel smooth. And this is just a precaution because there are going to be places when we lay the PEX in between or down into the Omega channel, there are going to be spaces between the actual pieces of the heat transfer plate because they will be expanding and contracting, so we leave a gap for them. So technically there could be an area where the PEX pipe is bare and expanding and contracting and rubbing against the plywood. So just to be safe, because it's in the floors, we'll never see it, we'd never know if there's a problem. I like to just make sure everything's nice and smooth so that if there is any contact, if there's any friction, there are no problems. And also nice to just double check how it sits in the end here. So you can see it sitting in the end here. Just clear the bottom, and again I just want to make sure there's no pinching, because when I put the floor on top I want the PEX pipe to be able to expand and contract without any friction from the top of the floor either. So if it's too pinched in here, then the wood from the actual finished floor could rub against the PEX. One last step, and this is totally optional. So this piece of plywood is finished. I've routed it entirely. You can see this is a piece that's central in the floor, and there are no corners. It's cut all the way across, so there's a weak point at each one of these. I don't have to do this. If I handle it gingerly, it's not going to break apart. It's not the end of the world if it does. It just makes laying it down easier if you lay one piece down rather than 3 or 4 little pieces. So what you can do is just grab some scrap wood and then just put a screw in the end, and on every section or every other section alternating between the 2 pieces. And then you'd have enough, you just need a little extra support, that's all. So I'm using a 1/2" double flute straight bit. I've used a 5/8, and I preferred the 5/8, but it broke, so I'm down to this one. I've got it set at about 5/8 depth. Again, I want to have it deep enough so that the PEX will be riding in here just by itself. So I want to create a nice smooth surface. I don't want any rough edges anywhere in here because it could make contact. You don't want it to, but you never know. So just to be safe, again, always prepare for the worst. So quite frankly, if anybody else out there knows a better technique than this, by all means leave it in the comments below. This is the part of the job I dislike the most, and there may be a better way, so let's hear what you have to say about it. So what I do is I first start with this interior cut, again in my rough shape of the bend of the PEX. And then what I'm going to do next is just do a series of thin ring cuts past that. I'm not going to go all the way because I want to have enough base support for my router base. And so then once I've got those 3 or 4 of those extra cuts, then I'm going to trim out what remains, and I've left it nice and thin, so it's going to kind of chip out on its own. It saves a bit of time, but you've got to be careful. Don't continue to route until you clear the area, remove the debris, and then route again. Again, just be safe. What I'll be left with is an outside edge around here, and that I'm just going to do by hand, a little bit more delicately, more of a light touch, and then just routing that out. My goal is to is to have smooth edges all around. In case there's any contact made, everything will be smooth. The PEX pipe won't get damaged because it will be flexing, it will be expanding, and this is the area that takes up that expansion. So this is important. It's important this is nice and clean, nice and smooth, and has enough room for the PEX to expand freely.